It was supposed to be just another Tuesday morning at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, casting long shadows across Terminal C as thousands of passengers shuffled through security checkpoints, half awake and clutching their morning coffee. But what nobody knew, not the TSA agents scanning bags, not the travelers waiting in line, not even the janitor mopping near Gate 47, was that among them walked a woman with a plan so calculated, so audacious, that it would make international headlines by the end of the day. Her name was Patricia Henderson, a 42-year-old woman with perfectly highlighted blonde hair, designer sunglasses perched on her head despite the early hour, and a baby stroller that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But that stroller, gleaming and pristine, wasn't carrying what everyone assumed it was carrying, and Patricia knew that if her plan worked, she'd be landing in London 12 hours later as a very, very wealthy woman, if it worked. Patricia had been planning this moment for 6 months. 6 months of research, of studying airport security protocols, of watching YouTube videos about TSA procedures, of joining online forums where people discussed, hypothetically of course, how certain items might pass through scanners undetected. She'd even flown internationally 3 times in the past 4 months, each trip a reconnaissance mission, studying how security agents reacted to passengers traveling with infants, how thoroughly they inspected strollers, how distracted they became when a baby started crying, and what she'd learned had given her confidence. Traveling parents, especially mothers with babies, got a different kind of treatment. Security agents were often more sympathetic, more rushed, more willing to wave someone through, without the intense scrutiny they applied to solo travelers or groups of young men. Patricia didn't have a baby. She'd never wanted children, had always found them noisy and inconvenient. But she'd borrowed one for today. Well, borrowed was a strong word. Her sister Rachel had been hesitant when Patricia asked to take 8-month-old Emma on what she called a quick trip to see an old college friend in London. Rachel had questions, reasonable ones, about why Patricia needed to take her daughter overseas for just a weekend. But Patricia had always been persuasive, had always known exactly which emotional strings to pull. She'd cried, talked about how lonely she'd been since her divorce, how she just wanted to feel like part of a family again, how it would mean the world to bond with her niece. Rachel had relented, and now here was Patricia, pushing a luxury stroller through Terminal C with a baby that wasn't hers and approximately $2.4 million worth of stolen jewelry hidden in a specially constructed compartment beneath the stroller's seat. The jewelry had come from Patricia's previous life, the one before the divorce lawyers and the bankruptcy filing, and the desperate scramble to maintain the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. She'd worked as a personal assistant to Vivian Carmichael, a Texas oil heiress whose jewelry collection was legendary among Dallas high society. Patricia had been trusted completely, had been given access to security codes, safe combinations, insurance documents. Vivian had treated her like family, which made what Patricia did next feel almost justified in her twisted logic. 3 weeks ago, during a charity gala at Vivian's estate, Patricia had carefully, methodically, stolen pieces from the collection. Not the most famous ones, nothing that would be immediately missed, but items valuable enough to set her up for life if she could just get them overseas to a buyer she'd connected with through encrypted messaging apps. The buyer was in London, ready to pay cash, no questions asked. All Patricia had to do was get past airport security with merchandise that would light up an X-ray scanner like a Christmas tree if it was detected in her luggage. That's where the stroller came in. Patricia had commissioned modifications from a man she'd found through a contact who knew someone who specialized in, let's say, unconventional luggage alterations. The stroller now had a double-layered base, the top layer perfectly normal, designed to hold diapers, wipes, baby bottles, all the standard infant supplies. But beneath that, accessible only by removing a false bottom that clicked into place with magnetic seals, was a lead-lined compartment just large enough to hold the jewelry wrapped in specialized fabric designed to scatter X-ray beams. The man who'd built it, whose name Patricia never learned, and whose face she'd only seen in shadow, had assured her it would work. He'd charged her $15,000, and had shown her test scans proving the compartment was virtually invisible to standard airport scanning equipment. Virtually invisible. That word virtually kept echoing in Patricia's mind as she approached the security checkpoint. The line was long, snaking back through the roped-off maze that airports use to manage crowds. Patricia positioned herself behind a large family, parents with 3 young children who were already arguing about who got to carry which toy through the scanner. Perfect cover. She kept her expression calm, occasionally bouncing the stroller gently to keep Emma comfortable. The baby, thankfully, was in a good mood this morning, gurgling happily and playing with a soft rattle. Patricia had made sure to give her a bottle right before entering the airport, timing it perfectly so Emma would be content and quiet during the crucial security screening. A crying baby might attract sympathy, but it also attracted attention, and attention was the last thing Patricia wanted right now. As she waited, Patricia studied the TSA agents working the checkpoint. There were 4 of them visible, 2 managing the conveyor belt and X-ray monitor, 1 checking IDs and boarding passes, and 1 doing random additional screenings at a separate table. The X-ray operator was a middle-aged woman with short gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, her expression neutral as she watched bags pass through the scanner on her monitor. Patricia watched her carefully, trying to read her body language, trying to gauge how thorough she was being. The woman barely glanced up between bags, her attention fixed on the screen, hands occasionally reaching for controls to adjust the image or rotate the digital view of suspicious items. Next to her stood a younger man, maybe late 20s, with a carefully maintained beard and alert eyes that scanned the crowd even while his colleague focused on the monitor. He was the wild card, Patricia thought. He looked like someone who took his job seriously, who might notice details that others missed. The family ahead of Patricia finally reached the checkpoint, and chaos erupted as expected. The parents were unprepared, hadn't removed laptops from bags, hadn't taken off their children's shoes, hadn't organized their carry-ons efficiently. The TSA agents had to repeatedly instruct them, their patience visibly thinning. Patricia used the distraction to her advantage, smoothly preparing her own items. She had 2 small carry-on bags, both packed strategically with normal travel items, nothing that would raise suspicion. She'd dressed carefully too, choosing an outfit that screamed suburban mother, yoga pants, an expensive but understated sweater, sneakers that cost $300 but looked casual. She even wore minimal jewelry, just her wedding ring which she'd kept after the divorce, because it had a 2-carat diamond and small pearl earrings. Everything about her appearance was designed to make her forgettable. Just another tired mother traveling with an infant. When her turn came, Patricia lifted her bags onto the conveyor belt with practiced ease, then approached the ID checkpoint. The agent barely looked at her, glancing at her driver's license and boarding pass, comparing the photo to her face in that cursory way that suggested he'd already checked 1,000 IDs this morning and would check 1,000 more before his shift ended. He handed her documents back with a nod, and Patricia moved toward the metal detector. This was it. The stroller was right behind her on the conveyor belt, Emma still strapped inside, approaching the X-ray scanner. Patricia's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her breathing steady, her expression relaxed. She'd practiced this moment in her mind hundreds of times. The key was to appear completely normal, completely confident, as if she had nothing to hide. She stepped through the metal detector, and nothing beeped. Of course it didn't. She'd been meticulous about removing anything that might trigger it. On the other side, she waited for her bags, watching from the corner of her eye as the stroller entered the X-ray machine. The female agent's eyes fixed on her monitor, and Patricia felt time slow down. Every second felt like an hour as the stroller's image appeared on the screen, processed through the scanner, analyzed by technology designed to detect exactly what Patricia was trying to hide. But then the stroller emerged on the other side, and the agent's expression hadn't changed. She was already looking at the next item, a businessman's leather briefcase. Patricia let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It had worked. The compartment was invisible, just like she'd been promised. But then the younger male agent, the one with the alert eyes, stepped forward. He wasn't looking at the X-ray monitor. He was looking at the stroller, at Patricia, his head tilted slightly as if something didn't quite add up. Patricia's blood turned cold. This wasn't part of the plan. She'd expected to just collect her items and move on, but now this agent was approaching, his hand reaching for the stroller. Patricia forced a smile, the kind of weary but friendly smile that mothers give when they're used to people commenting on their babies. She had to play this perfectly. One wrong word, one hint of nervousness, and everything could unravel. The agent smiled back, but it didn't reach his eyes. He spoke in a polite but firm tone, the kind of voice that suggests a request, but really means a command. He needed to do a quick additional screening of the stroller, just standard procedure, nothing to worry about. Patricia nodded, still smiling, even as panic clawed at her throat. She watched as he began to unbuckle Emma from the stroller, lifting the baby with surprising gentleness. Another TSA agent, a woman with kind eyes, came over to help, holding Emma while the male agent began his inspection. Patricia's mind raced through scenarios. What would he find? Would he notice the slight weight difference? Would he press on the bottom and discover it had some give to it that shouldn't be there? She needed a distraction, needed something to happen that would interrupt this inspection before it went too far. And then, as if the universe had heard her desperate thoughts, Emma started to cry. Not just fussing, but the full-throated wail of a baby who wanted her familiar surroundings back, who didn't like being held by strangers in this loud, bright place. The female agent tried to soothe her, bouncing her gently, but Emma only cried harder. Patricia stepped forward, reaching for her niece, allowing just the right amount of concern to show on her face. She was the child's aunt, she explained, taking Emma to visit family in London. The baby wasn't used to strangers, was probably getting tired and hungry. Could she please have her back? The situation was escalating in a way that worked in Patricia's favor. Emma's crying was drawing attention from other passengers, creating the exact kind of scene that TSA agents wanted to resolve quickly to keep the line moving. The male agent glanced at his colleague at the X-ray monitor, who shook her head slightly, indicating she hadn't seen anything suspicious on the scan. He looked back at the stroller, at Patricia, at the screaming baby, clearly doing a calculation in his mind about whether this was worth pursuing. Patricia held her breath, Emma now in her arms, the baby's cries muffled against her shoulder. She rubbed Emma's back soothingly, whispering gentle words, all while keeping her expression neutral and patient, showing no sign of the terror coursing through her veins. The male agent made his decision. He stepped back, gesturing toward the stroller with a nod that said she could take it. Patricia thanked him profusely, strapping Emma back into the stroller with hands that she willed not to shake. She collected her bags, arranged everything neatly, and began walking away from the checkpoint, her pace measured and unhurried, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. She'd made it. She'd actually made it through security with millions of dollars in stolen jewelry, and nobody had discovered her secret. But Patricia's relief was premature. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the gray-haired female agent at the X-ray monitor had noticed something. It was subtle, just a slight shadow on the stroller's image that didn't quite match the normal density patterns she'd seen in thousands of strollers over her 15-year career with TSA. She'd let it pass in the moment, distracted by the baby's crying and the need to keep the line moving, but it nagged at her. Something about that stroller wasn't right. During her break 20 minutes later, she pulled up the saved image on her terminal, studying it more carefully. The density of the stroller's base was inconsistent, showing a faint outline that suggested a compartment or void space that shouldn't exist in a standard stroller design. She zoomed in, adjusted the contrast, and there it was, faint but definitely present, evidence of a hidden space beneath the main storage area. Her name was Margaret Collins, and she'd seen a lot in her years working airport security. She'd caught people trying to smuggle everything from drugs to weapons to endangered animals. She'd developed an instinct for when something was off, even when she couldn't immediately put her finger on what. And this stroller was definitely off. Margaret called over her supervisor, a stern man named Derek Walsh, who'd been with TSA since its creation after September 11th. She showed him the image, pointed out the inconsistencies. Derek studied it carefully, his experienced eyes picking up on the same anomalies Margaret had noticed. They pulled up the passenger information, found Patricia Henderson's booking details, her flight to London Heathrow, departure gate B29, scheduled to leave in 90 minutes. Derek made a call to airport security, requesting they locate and detain the passenger for additional screening before boarding. Meanwhile, Patricia had no idea she was being discussed in a secure TSA office. She'd made her way to the international terminal, her confidence growing with each step away from the security checkpoint. She found a quiet seating area near her gate and sat down, Emma now sleeping peacefully in the stroller. Patricia allowed herself a moment to imagine her future. By tomorrow morning, she'd be sitting in a private office in London's Hatton Garden jewelry district, watching her buyer inspect the merchandise, seeing the approval in his eyes before he handed over a briefcase full of cash. She'd already planned her next steps: a flight to Switzerland, a deposit in a private bank, a new identity if necessary. She could disappear, start over somewhere warm and far from Dallas, from her failed marriage, from the bankruptcy and the shame and the desperate scrabbling for money. She just had to get on that plane first. An announcement crackled over the terminal speakers, something about a flight delay to Chicago, and Patricia barely registered it. She was scrolling through her phone, pretending to check messages, but actually rereading encrypted communications with her buyer, confirming the meeting time and location. She'd memorized everything, but couldn't resist checking one more time, making sure every detail was perfect. That's when she noticed them. 2 airport security officers, a man and a woman in uniform, walking through the terminal with purpose. They weren't casually patrolling. They were searching for someone, their eyes scanning faces, occasionally glancing at something one of them was holding, probably a photo or description. Patricia's stomach dropped. It couldn't be about her. There was no way. She'd passed through security, had been cleared. But paranoia crept in as she watched them get closer, saw how methodically they were checking each gate area, each seating section. Patricia made a split-second decision. She stood up, grabbing her bags and starting to push the stroller away from the gate, toward a corridor that led to restrooms and a small food court. She walked quickly, but not so fast that she'd attract attention, just another traveler heading to the bathroom before a long flight. But as she glanced back, her heart sank. The security officers had changed direction. They were following her. One of them spoke into a radio clipped to his shoulder, his eyes locked on Patricia. There was no more denying it. They were coming for her. Patricia's mind raced through options, each one more desperate than the last. She could run, but where would she go? This was an airport, a secured area with nowhere to hide and no way to leave without going back through checkpoints. She could ditch the stroller, but that would mean abandoning the jewelry, and more importantly, abandoning Emma, which would make her look even more guilty. She could play innocent, act confused, pretend she had no idea what they wanted. That was her best option. Her only option, really. The security officers caught up with her near a Starbucks, their approach professional but unmistakably official. The male officer, his name tag reading J. Torres, addressed her by name, Patricia Henderson. They needed her to come with them for some additional security screening. There had been an irregularity detected in her luggage, and they needed to resolve it before she could board her flight. Patricia's hands tightened on the stroller handle, but she kept her voice steady, confused but cooperative. What kind of irregularity? She'd already been through security, had been cleared to proceed to her gate. Was there a problem with her bags? Officer Torres didn't elaborate, just repeated that she needed to come with them, gesturing toward a nondescript door marked "Security Personnel Only." Patricia had no choice but to comply. She followed them, pushing the stroller through the door into a back corridor that passengers never saw, the functional side of the airport where the illusion of sleek modernity gave way to concrete floors and fluorescent lighting. They led her to a small room with a metal table, a few chairs, and cameras mounted in the corners. Emma had woken up during the walk and was starting to fuss, her little face scrunching up in preparation for another crying session. Patricia lifted her from the stroller, holding her close, using the baby as both a shield and a prop. She was just an aunt traveling with her niece, she insisted to the officers. She didn't understand what this was about. Could they please explain what was going on? That's when Margaret Collins entered the room, followed by her supervisor, Derek Walsh. Margaret was carrying a tablet showing the X-ray image of the stroller, and her expression was all business. She introduced herself, explained her role with TSA, and then got straight to the point. Their scanning equipment had detected an anomaly in the stroller's structure, suggesting the presence of a hidden compartment. They needed to inspect the stroller more thoroughly. Patricia felt the walls closing in. This was the moment she'd dreaded, the moment when everything could fall apart. But she couldn't show fear, couldn't give them any reason to dig deeper into her background, to start asking questions about why she might have a modified stroller. She had to maintain her innocence, had to make them believe this was all a terrible misunderstanding. She handed Emma to the female security officer and stepped toward the stroller, her voice taking on an edge of indignation. "This was ridiculous," she said. The stroller was expensive, sure, but it was a high-end European brand. Maybe the design just looked unusual on their scanners. She'd be happy to show them there was nothing wrong with it, nothing hidden, nothing illegal. She began unpacking the upper storage basket, pulling out diapers, wipes, bottles, laying them on the table with exaggerated movements, playing the part of an offended but cooperative citizen. But Margaret wasn't watching the items being removed. She was studying the stroller's base, running her hands along the bottom, feeling for inconsistencies. And then she found it, a slight give in the material, a place where the bottom wasn't quite as solid as it should be. She pressed harder, and there was an audible click as the magnetic seal released. The room went silent. Patricia's act of indignation died on her lips as Margaret carefully lifted away the false bottom, revealing the lead-lined compartment beneath. And there, wrapped in specialized fabric, gleaming even in the harsh fluorescent light, was the jewelry, necklaces dripping with diamonds, bracelets of platinum and sapphires, rings with stones so large they looked fake, but definitely weren't, earrings that belonged in museum displays. The officers stared, and Margaret let out a low whistle. This was significantly more than just an irregularity. This was, very clearly, an attempt to smuggle highly valuable items across international borders. And based on the professional nature of the concealment, this wasn't Patricia's first rodeo. Patricia's face had gone white. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could she say? The evidence was literally laid out on the table in front of her, undeniable and damning. Derek Walsh was already on his phone, calling for additional security and contacting Dallas PD. This had gone from a TSA matter to a potential criminal investigation involving theft, smuggling, and probably a dozen other charges that Patricia didn't even want to think about. Officer Torres stepped forward, his expression hard now, any pretense of courtesy gone. He needed Patricia to place her hands on the table and remain calm while they sorted this situation out. Did she understand? Patricia nodded numbly, her hands shaking as she placed them flat on the cold metal surface. This couldn't be happening. 6 months of planning, $15,000 spent on modifications, all the research and preparation and careful execution, and it had all fallen apart because of one agent's instinct. One closer look at an X-ray image. She thought about Vivian Carmichael, about the moment when the theft would be discovered, about the police investigation that would inevitably lead back to her. She thought about her sister Rachel, who'd trusted her with Emma, who would be devastated and furious when she found out what Patricia had really been doing. She thought about the London buyer who'd be waiting in vain for merchandise that would never arrive. Most of all, she thought about the prison cell that was almost certainly in her future. The door opened again, and 2 Dallas police detectives entered, their badges visible on their belts. They introduced themselves as Detective Sarah Brennan and Detective Marcus Lee, and their questions started immediately. Where had Patricia obtained the jewelry? Who was she transporting it to? Was she working alone or part of a larger operation? Patricia knew she should ask for a lawyer, should refuse to answer anything until she had legal representation. But shock and desperation made her stupid. She started talking, the words tumbling out in a confused rush. The jewelry belonged to her former employer. She hadn't meant to steal it, not really. She'd just been borrowing it, planning to return it, needed the money so desperately after the divorce. The lies sounded pathetic even to her own ears, and the detectives' expressions made it clear they weren't buying any of it. Detective Brennan picked up one of the necklaces, a stunning piece with a central emerald surrounded by diamonds, and held it up to the light. This was Victorian era, she noted, probably worth several $100,000 on its own. She looked at Patricia with something like pity mixed with disgust. Did Patricia have any idea how much time she was facing? Grand theft, smuggling, crossing state lines with stolen property, child endangerment for involving a minor in a criminal enterprise. They could make the charges stack up to decades. Patricia's eyes filled with tears, the reality of her situation finally breaking through the denial and desperation. She'd destroyed her life. Not just destroyed it, but obliterated it. And she'd done it to herself with her own greed and entitlement. In another part of the airport, Vivian Carmichael was being contacted by Dallas PD. She'd been in her River Oaks mansion, preparing for a charity luncheon, when Detective Lee's call came through. The news that her missing jewelry had been recovered sent her into a whirlwind of emotions, relief, anger, and profound betrayal. Patricia had been like family, had been trusted implicitly for 8 years. Vivian had defended Patricia when others in her social circle had whispered that she was too ambitious, too calculating. And this was how that trust had been repaid. Vivian immediately called her lawyer, then her insurance company, setting in motion a chain of legal proceedings that would ensure Patricia faced the full consequences of her actions. There would be no mercy, no sympathy for hard times or desperate circumstances. Patricia had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Back in the security room, Patricia sat in handcuffs now. Emma returned to her arms under supervision because the baby wouldn't stop crying for anyone else. The irony wasn't lost on Patricia. She'd used this innocent child as a prop in her scheme, had risked Emma's well-being and Rachel's trust, all for jewelry that she'd never get to sell, money she'd never get to spend. She looked down at Emma's tear-streaked face and felt something crack inside her, some last piece of delusion that had let her justify her actions. She'd become exactly what she'd always despised, someone who used people, who put her own desires above everything else, who'd convinced herself that the rules didn't apply to her because she'd been dealt a bad hand in life. The processing took hours. Photographs of the jewelry, documentation of every piece, paperwork that seemed endless. Patricia was eventually transported to Dallas County Jail, charged with multiple felonies. Her bail set so high there was no possibility of her making it. Her mugshot would be all over the news by evening, her name dragged through every social media platform, her face becoming synonymous with entitled criminality. The YouTube videos would be brutal, the comment sections merciless. Airport Karen tries to smuggle millions in baby stroller, karma strikes at security. The story had everything viewers loved: privilege, downfall, instant justice, a satisfying ending where the bad guy got caught. Emma was returned to Rachel that afternoon, the reunion tearful and tense. Rachel had been called by police and informed of her sister's arrest, told that her daughter had been unwittingly used in a smuggling operation. The betrayal cut deep, the violation of trust between sisters. Rachel would spend years trying to process how Patricia could have done something so reckless, so dangerous, involving an 8-month-old baby in a criminal enterprise. She'd never let Patricia near her daughter again. That much was certain. Some betrayals were too fundamental to forgive. For Margaret Collins, the TSA agent who'd spotted the anomaly, it was validation of her experience and instincts. She'd spent 15 years looking at X-ray images, training her eyes to spot the subtle inconsistencies that indicated deception. She'd caught a big one today, and while she wouldn't get any reward beyond commendation in her file, she'd feel proud every time she told the story. She'd prevented millions in stolen goods from leaving the country, had helped bring a criminal to justice. That meant something. In an era where TSA agents were often maligned and mocked, where their work was seen as security theater rather than legitimate law enforcement, this was proof that vigilance mattered, that training and experience made a difference. The news coverage was intense. Patricia Henderson became a cautionary tale, her story dissected on morning shows and evening news broadcasts. Criminal psychologists weighed in on what drives someone from legitimate work to elaborate theft. Financial experts discussed the desperation that divorce and bankruptcy can create. Airport security analysts used her case as an example of why screening procedures exist and why they shouldn't be relaxed no matter how much passengers complain about inconvenience. Patricia's ex-husband gave an interview, carefully distancing himself from her actions, expressing shock that the woman he'd been married to for 12 years could have done something so calculated and criminal. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had commentary. And Patricia became less a person and more a symbol, a representation of entitlement and greed, and the inevitable justice that follows. In her jail cell, Patricia had plenty of time to think about the choices that had led her here. The moment she'd decided that stealing from someone who'd trusted her was acceptable. The moment she'd involved her niece in a criminal scheme. The moment she'd believed she was smart enough to outsmart airport security systems designed by experts and operated by trained professionals. Every choice had felt justified at the time, driven by desperation, and a sense that she deserved better, that life had been unfair to her, that she was owed a way out of her financial problems. But sitting in that cell, wearing an orange jumpsuit, facing decades in prison, Patricia finally understood something she should have grasped much earlier. Nobody owed her anything. The world didn't care about her problems, her wounded pride, her fear of losing status. And the moment she'd decided that her needs justified hurting others, stealing from someone kind, endangering a child, she'd forfeited any claim to sympathy. Her trial, when it eventually came, was quick and decisive. The evidence was overwhelming, the prosecution's case airtight. Patricia's lawyer negotiated a plea deal to avoid the maximum sentence, but even with the deal, she was looking at 15 years in federal prison. The judge, a woman with steel gray hair and no patience for entitlement, delivered a scathing rebuke during sentencing. Patricia had been given opportunities and advantages that many people never receive, the judge noted. She'd held a position of trust, had access to wealth and privilege, and she'd betrayed all of it out of greed and a sense that normal rules didn't apply to her. The sentence reflected not just the theft, but the elaborate deception, the child endangerment, the complete absence of remorse until she'd been caught. Justice, the judge concluded, required both punishment and deterrence. And Patricia Henderson would serve as an example of what happens when someone believes they're above the law. The jewelry was returned to Vivian Carmichael in a formal ceremony that made local news. Vivian stood surrounded by security, accepting each piece back from police custody, her relief visible but tempered by the sadness of betrayal. She'd have to vet her staff more carefully going forward, would have to rebuild trust that Patricia had shattered. Some of the pieces would never feel the same, would always carry the taint of theft and deception. But they were back, and that was something. Vivian donated a portion of the jewelry's value to a charity supporting victims of theft and fraud, turning her pain into something constructive. For the TSA agents at Dallas-Fort Worth, Patricia's case became legendary, the story told to new recruits as an example of why vigilance matters, why that nagging feeling that something isn't quite right should never be ignored. Margaret Collins received formal recognition, a plaque and a handshake from the airport director, acknowledgement that her experience and instincts had made a real difference. She returned to her post at the X-ray monitor, studying the endless stream of bags and strollers and carry-ons, knowing that somewhere in that stream, another Patricia Henderson might be trying to cheat the system, might believe they're clever enough to beat security. And Margaret would be watching, ready to spot the subtle anomalies, the faint shadows that indicated deception. The YouTube video about Patricia's case would rack up millions of views. The comment section filled with a mix of schadenfreude and moral lessons. Viewers loved seeing entitled people face consequences, loved the karma of someone's elaborate plan falling apart because of one alert professional doing their job well. The story had everything: drama, suspense, a satisfying resolution where justice prevailed. It reminded people that actions have consequences, that crime doesn't pay, that trying to outsmart security systems designed by experts is almost always a losing game. Patricia Henderson's 30 minutes of infamy would live on in internet archives, a permanent reminder of what happens when greed and entitlement collide with professional vigilance and inevitable justice. And in her cell, years later, Patricia would sometimes think about that morning at the airport, about the moment she pushed the stroller through security, her heart pounding, believing she'd gotten away with it. She'd think about the male TSA agent who'd almost discovered her secret during the additional screening, about how close she'd come to abandoning her plan. She'd think about Emma's crying, which had inadvertently saved her in that moment but couldn't save her from the more thorough investigation that followed. Most of all, she'd think about Margaret Collins, the gray-haired woman at the X-ray monitor who'd looked at an image one more time, who'd trusted her instincts, who'd made the call that unraveled everything. Patricia had underestimated the power of experience and training, had believed that money spent on modifications would be enough to fool systems designed to catch exactly what she was doing. She'd been wrong, catastrophically wrong, and the price of that miscalculation was measured in years of freedom lost, relationships destroyed, and a reputation that could never be repaired. The story of Airport Karen and her jewelry smuggling scheme would be retold countless times, each retelling a lesson about hubris, justice, and the inevitable moment when careful plans meet cold reality. Patricia's story didn't end with her incarceration. The ripple effects continued spreading outward, touching lives she'd never even considered. The man who'd built the modified stroller, the shadowy figure she'd paid $15,000, was eventually tracked down through financial records subpoenaed during the investigation. He faced his own charges for conspiracy and manufacturing devices intended for smuggling. His workshop, hidden in a nondescript warehouse outside Fort Worth, contained dozens of modified luggage pieces, each one a testament to an underground industry catering to people who believed they could outsmart the law. The London buyer, waiting in his Hatton Garden office, realized something had gone wrong when Patricia never showed up for their meeting. He disappeared within hours, abandoning that identity, moving on to other deals with other desperate criminals. He'd lose no sleep over Patricia's arrest. In his world, people got caught all the time. It was the cost of doing business. And he'd learned long ago not to form attachments or feel sympathy for partners who weren't smart enough or lucky enough to complete their end of the transaction. Rachel filed for a restraining order, ensuring Patricia could never contact Emma again, even after her eventual release. The trauma of knowing her daughter had been used as cover for a felony would take years of therapy to process. She'd blame herself for trusting Patricia, for not seeing the warning signs of her sister's desperation and moral decay. Family gatherings would be forever changed, Patricia's name becoming taboo, her existence erased from conversations as if she'd never been part of their lives at all. And at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, life continued its relentless pace. Thousands of passengers passed through Terminal C every day, most of them honest travelers with legitimate reasons for their journeys. But among them, occasionally, walked others with secret plans and hidden contraband, believing themselves clever enough to beat the system. And watching them all, analyzing every bag and stroller and carry-on that passed through those X-ray scanners, were professionals like Margaret Collins, experienced and vigilant, ready to spot the anomalies that revealed deception. Patricia Henderson's failed smuggling attempt had become more than just a story. It had become a warning, a reminder that in the careful dance between security and deception, experience and technology usually won, and karma always found a way to balance the scales.